So good morning and welcome to the latest webinar by Mobilityways. Today, we are looking at using travel surveys to spark data-driven decision-making. If that's not the webinar you wanted to be on, I would leave now. We're going to spend the next hour together. We're covering essentially a focus on effective travel surveys. So key pillars around best practice and bad practice for staff surveys, how to ensure data is reliable and actionable, tactics for achieving a high response rate, and the importance of getting a representative response. My name is Mark Hand. I'm a director at Mobilityways, and I'll be chairing the session today. Basically, we've broken it down into three parts. We've got a couple of speakers from Ipsos UK who will be sharing their knowledge and expertise with you, and that will be until roughly 11:30. And then, as we like to do, we're opening up the whole of the second session and opening that up to questions and answers. But as part of that first session, we've also got our consultant, Millie Botting, who will also be sharing her expertise in terms of the application of practical travel surveys to deliver action. If you've got any questions through the day, please use the Q&A function. We love getting the questions, and I'll share as many of those with the speakers when we get to the Q&A section. So in terms of our speakers, we've got two speakers today from Ipsos. As I said, Ipsos UK generate evidence which draws together public, business and stakeholder attitudes and behaviours to help clients make better decisions for the future of our transport and infrastructure systems. Our first speaker, Kyra, is Associate Director at Ipsos UK. She's been there for 7 years, and she's going to talk about best practice for conducting travel surveys and giving insights from what is one of the world's biggest research companies. She'll be joined later for the Q&A session by Lizzie Copp, also Research Director at Ipsos, who has kindly worked with us on previous webinars and also at ZC3. And then, as I said, coming up second on the agenda is Millie Botting. She's a commutology consultant. Commutology is the science of the commute. Millie's background is environmental science, and she's going to focus on that practical advice, as I say, needed to create an actionable survey that can inform your sustainability policy. So I'm going to stop talking now. Remember, please do put those questions in the Q&A. And I will ask Kyra to come and do the first session for you. Thanks very much.
Hello, and thank you, Mark, and thank you very much for having me here today. So yeah, my name is Kyra Xypolia. Don't worry about being able to pronounce my surname. I'm an associate director at Ipsos UK, and I work in the transport and infrastructure team within Ipsos Social Research Institute. And surveys is a big part of what we do. So I'm here today to talk about best practice, key tips, and avoiding pitfalls in surveys in general, but also specifically in travel and staff surveys. Next slide, please. But we could fill out long sessions talking about all that. So for today, to make it easier, we've boiled it all down to 5 key questions to think about when designing survey approach. So I should say, although I'm going to cover a few general things, the main focus is on staff surveys and therefore online surveys. So I'm not going really to cover other modes of data collection. Next slide, please. So starting with the first question, which is all about sampling. Next slide, please. So first of all, we need to remember why we need to care about sampling design and why it is important. A good sampling design mitigates risk of random and fixed error, which would impact the sample representativeness. So the random error is produced by chance, and it will be different each time you measure something. It can be estimated and represented by a margin of error that you might have heard. And statistical theory models randomness in surveys really well, but keep in mind that we can only really do this, like calculate the margin of error for probability samples, which we'll cover in a bit. The sample size can help limit the random error, but there are also fixed errors, which are also referred to as bias, which means we will be systematically wrong whenever we take a measurement. And a lot of the time, we will not have a way of knowing whether our survey results are biased. And even if we suspect they might be biased, we probably will not know how biased they are. But that's why a lot of the design decisions that we will make when pulling together a survey or a sample will be focused on reducing or eliminating the risk of bias. But increasing the sample size will not help against this bias. And this is why a properly conducted poll with 1,000 people will give you accurate results, but a social media poll with self-selecting sample of 10,000 will not really give you accurate results. Next slide, please. Thank you. So 4 key considerations about sampling in general. So starting with a sample frame, this is the list of potential people in your target population that you may invite to take part in the survey. It is important that it is a reliable source, especially if you want to generalize the findings of the research. And for example, if you're conducting a staff survey, your database, the sample frame, would need to be reliable. If for any reason it misses entire parts of the organization, then the survey and the findings couldn't really be generalized to the whole of the organization. So with regards to selecting the sample, effectively, there are 2 ways of doing that. One is a probability method. You randomly select who to invite from your sample source, meaning statistically speaking, there is a known chance for everyone to be invited, which is not 0. And there are different ways of randomly selecting your sample, a systematic way, a stratified. But the key thing to remember about a random probability is whoever is selected randomly from the sample needs to conduct the survey. You cannot deselect someone who's refused to take part and select someone else from the sample retrospectively, just out of convenience. So this is why probability surveys usually need more time in field to go back to the same people multiple times, and they're usually more expensive. The other way of selecting your sample is non-probability and non-random. This includes quota surveys that you might have heard, that you specify a pool of people that matches your target population and key demographics like age, gender, etc. But that means that any source of variation not related to the quotas that you have set is a potential cause of bias. But it's more affordable, and even if it's not random, it's much better than having a self-selecting sample. But I said all that, and for a staff survey, I would say that you don't really need to worry about either of these methods, as most for most staff surveys, you're going to invite all your staff to take part. Sample size, as I mentioned a bit earlier, the size could help against the random error in your survey, although with diminishing returns really. So it's not always worth increasing the sample size of your survey. And for your staff surveys, again, I would say that you don't really have to worry about the size per se, but it leads me to the 4th point on this slide about response rates. Not everyone you will invite to the survey will take part, even if you have the best design. But for a staff survey, it's more about the response rate, that you have a good percentage of the organization that they take part in the survey. But not just at an overall level, think about the analysis. If you want to break it down by different departments, by different teams, make sure that you get a good response rate at that level. Next slide, please. So moving to the next question, how to engage respondents and how to maximize the response rate. Next slide, please. So as the title says here, the importance of the invitation is not to be underestimated. Don't forget to warn people up that the survey you're doing is coming. No one really responds that well to a cold call. And the next few points on the slide here are things that people will want to know in advance, like why is it important to take part? how long will it take me to complete the survey? And obviously the shorter, the better. And what will I need to do? Will I be selecting responses from lists, or will I be writing my own thoughts? And this is a common practice for surveys, so people can give informed consent to take part, but it's also giving people information and gaining their interest. And also very key here is to provide reassurance about data privacy, confidentiality, and anonymity, especially if there are questions that might be a little bit more sensitive, but also if we ask people to provide information on the traveling patterns or admit some behaviors or views that might not be easily admittable. And this is also something related to the response rate that we covered before, and what analysis you might do. If we were to report on findings by team level for a team of like 5, for example, and you don't get a good response rate either, it's likely you could easily identify who said what in that team. So provide this reassurance in your invitation, but make sure that it's honest and you keep to it as well. But all that said, do try and be concise and make it visually appealing. Break down the text with icons to make the call to actions to stand out. There is quite a lot of research about the impact of something to be kind of like more accessible and visually appealing on response rates. And finally, you can increase the chance of people taking part in your survey by offering incentives. There has been a fair amount of research on the effectiveness of incentives, and in brief, and maybe not too surprisingly, bigger incentives work better than smaller ones, and cash works best, and then cash-like vouchers. There's also unconditional incentives, so everyone who is invited gets an incentive that work better than conditional ones. I would say for most surveys, conditional incentives are being used because they're a lot cheaper. Next slide, please. So yeah, some people will be quite hard to get hold of. And there are a few things that you can do to maximize the chance that everyone see your invitations. So a couple of things to highlight here is to try and contact people at different times on different days. Even if you send emails, if you send them all only on Monday mornings, it could be someone's non-working day, and the email can get buried in the inbox by the time they come back. And people also have like different patterns how they engage with emails, and especially for general communications. And where possible, try multiple contact modes. And for staff surveys, you can be quite creative about it as well, because you can use business meetings to inform people that the survey is coming, to remind them, to tell them like when you send the email that they have missed, or do it through team leaders or through line managers if you think that would be more effective. And that means that you have contacted them through emails, people, meetings, and all sorts of ways. Next slide, please. Thank you. And also, it would be good to have an accessible survey to support people taking part, and not deprioritizing that as well, making sure that there is, for example, clear color contrast between the text and background, or if you use images, to make sure that you provide some equivalent text as well. And also, whether it's a staff survey or not, many of us complete surveys on the go. So it's important to make it easy for people to take part from any device that works best for them to encourage participation. Next slide, please. Okay. So third question, what to measure, which is all about the survey measurement itself, the questionnaire. Next slide, please. So to minimize measurement error in your survey, use plain English. If you need to reread the sentence a lot to understand it, and then need to really think how you need to answer. For example, if you agree with something, would you be saying that you prefer to walk, or would you prefer like something else? If it's not clear, then the quality of the data that you will get back will likely not be good either. So the best practice is to cognitively test any newly designed questions. But even if you don't do proper cognitive interviews for your staff survey, it will still be good to kind of soft test the questions. You can ask someone who wasn't involved in the survey design to go through the questions and try to answer them and then give you feedback. And also in travel surveys, we ask a lot about travel behaviors, which involve a lot of frequency questions. So make sure that the frequency scale matches the time frame that you're asking about, that the frequency scale includes mutually exclusive response codes. Don't say, for example, 1 to 2 times and 2 times or more, because someone who does something 2 times, they wouldn't be sure which of the 2 codes should be select. And make sure that the time frame is easy to recall as well. The more recent, obviously, easier to remember, or accept any recall bias if you're asking for a longer time frame. And finally, make sure that you do give a time frame. So your question is specific. That's better and more easy to understand to answer than asking what people do in a typical week, because that can vary and people find it harder to answer. Check the flow of the questionnaire, but also here you can think about the prime effects. If you ask, for example, about attitudes to environment first, it could affect how people answer to the following questions. So think about how you want to structure the questionnaire. But going back to the questions themselves, again, try not to lead in the way you ask the question, nor in the response codes that you give. There needs to be a response code for everyone. Even if you wouldn't like to end up with a large proportion of people saying don't know, it's still a valid response for people who aren't sure about that question. And also an overwhelming and tiring questionnaire can make people speed through the survey without thinking their answers. These are called speeders and flatliners, especially if you include questions with the same scale over and over again. You might find that people give the same answer in all those scales just because they're tired and they just click through without thinking through the questions. So think about your objectives as well, but also the people's experience, and ask the questions from their lenses. And also think about whether you want that open-ended question, because they do take more time to complete and they do put people off. Sometimes in the technical metrics that we get in surveys, we see where people drop from a survey. An open-ended is like a common culprit. And if you want those like verbatim responses, think about whether you might need quality research, if the quality research might be more suitable. And the final point here is about your analysis. Think about that and what questions or what data you already hold of your staff and what you might not have already. And you need to ask those in the survey. For example, you might already have how long they've been in your organization, but you might not have gender. You need to ask about gender in your survey if you need to analyze the data by that. Next slide, please. So fourth question is about timings. Next slide, please. And 2 key tips about that. Make sure that you allow enough time for analysis and any other follow-up research you might need to conduct. Sometimes we do need to do some focus groups to understand some survey results better. And you might be driven by a deadline, but make sure that you have allowed enough time for the analysis and reporting alone, because that will take usually a bit more time than anticipated. Then for travel surveys in particular, fieldwork timings are very important. So really think about what you're measuring before you decide when to conduct fieldwork. If, for example, you do a survey early January and you ask people how they commuted in the last 4 weeks, you're probably not going to get results on a very typical week. Next slide, please. Thank you. So finally, you've done the survey. Now, what next? Next slide, please. So again, make sure that you allow enough time even for preparing the data itself. It takes some time to process and manage the data to produce the final data set. That usually involves removing those speeders and flatliners that we mentioned earlier. If that's possible, it might not be possible because if you don't capture how much time it took people to complete the survey, you wouldn't be able to remove them. If you did have any open-ended questions, those verbatim responses would also need to be coded. And then thinking about your analysis, you might need to create some aggregate variables. For example, for a scale that you strongly agree and tend to agree, you might want to combine these two codes into agree. And similarly for travel frequency questions, your scale might be quite granular, but for your analysis, you might want to see what percentage travel in a certain way just on a weekly basis. So you need to combine those codes. The last point on this slide is not so much for staff surveys, but at this stage of data processing is when weighting is sometimes used to calibrate the results using certain known characteristics to make sure that the results are representative. Next slide, please. Thank you. So analyzing the data, even if you have a short survey, when you start looking at ways of breaking and crossing your data by other questions, it gets very easy to get lost in all that. So make sure to go back to your objectives and look how to answer those through the data than trying to figure out everything from the data that you've got. But also be aware of inferential errors. It's very human to tend to notice things that support our hypothesis and to ignore things that disprove them. So spend time to familiarize yourself with the data, try to answer your objectives, but note down what you're noticing, what you were expecting, and note down what you were not expecting either. You might not be able to answer all of it through the data that you've got, but it's all very useful to see. Next slide, please. Thank you. So finally, celebrate the success of your survey and thank people for taking part. If you could share with them the results or the action plan based on that, all the better. Record what you've learned and what you might need to do differently next time. It doesn't mean necessarily that something was wrong with your survey, but the results could have made you wonder and realize that it would be good to have had another question about a certain behavior, characteristic, to see if that would have played a role in people's views of choices. And also use your networks to share advice and exchange ideas as well. Is always invaluable. So that was from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I found that absolutely fascinating. There's already lots of questions that have come through. We'll hold on to those until the Q&A session after our next speaker. If you have joined since we started, if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A tab and we'll come to those in roughly 10 minutes. But I wanted to introduce next Millie Botting, who works for Mobilityways as a consultant. And she's going to take you through how to maximize, if we can get the word out, insights from your travel survey. So over to you, Millie.
Perfect. Thanks, Mark. So I'm going to delve into how you can maximize the insights from your travel survey. So our aim here is to kind of go beyond simple data collection. We want to explore the questions that you need to ask to truly understand your workplace's commuting behaviours and the factors that influence these behaviours. So that you can then focus on setting accurate baselines and using the data effectively to create meaningful strategies that makes commuting better for the employees, but also better for the environment. Next slide, please. So getting the right data kind of starts with asking the right questions. So it's not just about collecting data for the sake of it, it's about building a baseline that you can then use for change. So a good way to approach this is through 3 key themes. So you've got the how, why, and what. So how are people travelling to work? So you need to understand how employees are travelling to work to allow you to baseline your mode share and your emissions data. So for example, are people driving alone to work, or do you have a significant number using public transport, cycling or walking? So this is a great starting point to understand what's going on at your workplace, because if you don't know where you're starting from, it's impossible to measure the success of your targets or encourage meaningful change. You've then got the why. So this goes into a bit of a deeper level of understanding why are people choosing these factors, why are people choosing these commuting options? So are they motivated by the convenience of it, the cost, is it the speed, or is there other factors coming into play that are affecting their decisions? There might be some barriers they're facing, like lack of safe walking routes, or is there limited public transport in your area that's preventing people to change? So by knowing the motivations behind these choices can help you target your efforts where they can have the most impact, so you can really see that behaviour changed amongst employees. And then we've got the what. So what would encourage more sustainable travel amongst your staff population? So once you can understand the how and the why, you can start exploring what would motivate people to switch to more sustainable modes. So for example, would better cycling facilities make a difference? Or perhaps if you were to incentivise car sharing, would that encourage people to get someone else in their car and commute together to work? So this section is where you kind of move from that data collection to actually gaining actionable insight. And by approaching your survey with these core themes in mind, you'll be able to create a strong foundation for your policies and initiatives, and hopefully encourage people to start commuting in a more sustainable way. Next slide, please. So I'm going to delve into each of those kind of themes and what questions you can ask within those themes in particular. So when you look at the how, so we're going to look at closer of how people are commuting. So there's 3 key questions that at Mobilityways we always ask within our travel surveys, and they can help you to understand someone's current commuting behaviour. So the first of which is around the mode. So it's essential to capture what mode of transport people are using to commute. This can include kind of driving alone, whether that's cycling, walking, but it's also important to include the full range of commuting modes. So whether people are travelling in an electric vehicle or whether they're in a hybrid, an internal combustion engine vehicle. By capturing these specifics, it'll allow for accurate modal share data analysis, but also allow you to precisely capture the emissions associated with each mode and ultimately give you a fuller picture of how people are getting to work. Then also got the frequency of travelling to work. So how often are your employees commuting in? In today's world, we're very much in a hybrid work environment. You've got some offices that people are required to be in 5 days a week. You've also got some that people fully kind of work from home most of the time. People travelling in once or twice a month, while others are kind of travelling in on the regular. So by capturing the frequency, it can help identify the opportunities for impact and inform your working policies later down the line. So if you're aware of you have a working policy of people coming in 2 days a week and you want to increase that, you can see kind of how much that would impact the emissions from your commuting. Then finally, the third aspect of this is the distance of travel. So whether that's within miles or kilometres, it provides that insight of how far away people are living from their workplace. So longer commutes often mean higher emissions. So this can help understand where to prioritise your focus of your efforts. If you've got a large cohort of staff living far away, you know that might be more of an opportunity to reduce emissions than those who are living more locally and are already potentially active travelling to work. So at Mobilityways, when we ask these questions, they're designed to be as user-friendly as possible. So for example, with the mode, we'll always provide a drop-down so people can simply select their mode and see kind of the full range of options available. So again, with that, the option for electric vehicles or hybrid. For frequency, we want it to be as accurate as possible, but as easy as possible. So allowing people to kind of pop in whether they're traveling in 5 days a month, 4 days a week, and then we'll convert that when we're doing the emissions calculations. And again, for distance, some people work better in miles, some people work better in kilometres. We want them to give the most accurate representation of how far away they live. So giving employees that option to pop it in either format allows for that accurate data collection, which can then provide precise and valuable data and make the survey as easy as possible, which will hopefully result in a higher response rate from your staff as well. Next slide, please. So then using these 3 specific questions you can delve into a world of insight from just those 3 questions of your workplace commuting behaviour. But one way that we like to look at it is through your average commuter emissions level. So by using those, your frequency, the distance, and the mode of travel, we can then create the average commuter emissions level for each employee within the company. By creating the average, it allows for year-on-year comparison and site-by-site benchmarking. So employee numbers change over the years at different companies, so your total emissions will always change. But by having that average commuter emissions level, allow you to have that year-on-year comparison, so you can see whether you're meeting targets or whether you need to start targeting different areas to see that reduction in your emissions. And it helps you compare performance across different sites and across different departments as well. But this will also then help by calculating the average commuter emissions level. You can calculate the total emissions, which is often used by employers for reporting. So by ensuring that you've got a representative response rate across your survey, we can then scale this data up to understand what the total emissions within the company are, so that you can get a complete and reliable picture of the whole workforce's commuting impact and not just on an individual basis. Next slide, please. So we've kind of covered the how, so how people commuting to work, but then it's understanding the why. So whether people are using their current mode because it's convenient or due to it's the cheapest option, maybe it's the most reliable, or they enjoy the flexibility of driving to work. But by understanding the why, it will allow us to see what the key drivers to getting people to change their habits. So there's different factors you can use to take this into account. So different job roles might have different priorities. Personal circumstances often lead to different commuting needs and patterns. So if we take job roles, for example, so here I've got some data from an NHS trust, which shows that on average, people who work within the medical and dental sector are travelling just under 36 miles to work, whereas people within the estates team are actually travelling just under 6 miles to work. That is obviously around a 30-mile difference of their commute. So they're going to have a lot of different factors that come into their commute, which will influence their decisions, whether that's traffic on the commute, whether that's bus routes not going 36 miles out from their workplace. It just shows that when looking at the data, it's important to take into account the different roles people might have within a company, as that is something that can widely depend on their choices and then will influence what initiatives you choose to kind of put into effect from that. It's also important to understand the motivations by mode. So for example, if you've got a significant number of people driving alone to work because it's the fastest way for them to get to work, you need to address the speed and convenience to encourage when encouraging other options. So if you're encouraging them to car share, it's important to understand that they need that also to be the quickest option. It just helps put you in the mindset of your employees and understand what would kind of motivate them to change their behaviour. On the other hand, you might have people who are walking to work and they state that this is because they do so for health reasons, which you can then use within your communications to employees to highlight the health benefits of walking to work and further encourage other employees to do the same. Next slide, please. So once you've understood the how people are travelling to work, so what they're currently doing, and the why, so the motivations behind that. The next step is exploring what would encourage them to shift their behaviours. So we break this down into different modes. So what would encourage you to car share to work, what would encourage you to catch public transport to work, and what would encourage you to walk, run or cycle to work. Within the survey itself, it's important to make this as easy as possible for the responder. So we suggest providing maybe a drop-down list of potential incentives or scenarios that might encourage people. So for example, here we've popped in help finding a car share partner who lives near and works similar hours, and you see that around 31% of employees selected that option, just giving them a few ideas of what kind of options might be available. However, it's important to consider that with your own workplace circumstances within this. So for example, practicality matters. That you need to focus on feasible solutions within these options. There's no point in suggesting features that you're not going to be able to implement at your workplace. So for example, if you were discussing car share base or dedicated priority parking for those who car share, if this isn't going to be a realistic option at your organisation, you don't want to be popping that in the survey options, as it'll be giving your employees ideas that you're not necessarily going to be able to implement. But it's also important to consider your circumstances to understand what kind of options to pop in. So for example, if you are looking to reduce parking pressures on site, you want fewer people driving alone. So it's important to look at what those employees said that they currently drive alone would be encouraged by to car share. So filtering out that data when you're looking at the analysis to understand what your target audience would be encouraged by. So to give a kind of a real world example of this, we had an organisation who asked people what would encourage them to walk, run or cycle to work. And around 15% of the organisation said that they would like improved shower and changing facilities. So then they upgraded their shower and changing facilities, added some lockers in. And the next year when they came to do their annual travel survey, they saw an increase in people actively travelling to work. So it's showing that the data that you're getting from your travel survey can give you the tangible results when they've been actioned. So by understanding what would motivate these employees to change and focusing on the achievable interventions, you can implement these initiatives and hopefully have a meaningful impact from the initiatives, because you know that that is what would spark interest from your employees and drive them to change their behaviour. So kind of just summarise a few of the key points that I've made. So by making the most of your travel survey, you need a strong baseline of data to start with, so you know where you're starting from and then measure your success from that. A deeper understanding of the commuter motivations and how this can be effective for tracking your progress. So then armed with these insights, you can design your strategies, policies, initiatives within your workplace that can encourage sustainable behaviour changes and make commuting more environmentally friendly and efficient for not only the employee, but also the employer at each site. That's all from me. Hope that gave you a bit of an insight into travel survey questions. But yeah, if you've got any questions, we're on to Q&A time.
Thanks very much, Millie. And if I could ask Lizzie and Kyra to join us as well. Just to say, having obviously watched through that and been obviously very aware of what you do, Millie, I think the other thing when I'm talking to organisations that becomes increasingly important is the art of the possible. So what we're doing through the travel survey is understanding what people are doing, what they'd like to do, but what we need to understand as well is what could actually happen. And that's where the Commute IQ piece of work that we do next, which is postcode analysis, actually gives us those real world options that exist and also show us where the gaps in services are that we might be able to mitigate. When you put those two together, you've got a really powerful set of data. But let's go to the questions. So I've got several here. I'll read them out as they've come in, to be completely fair. And if anyone wants to just jump in and answer the ones that they would prefer or think they've got the best expertise on. So the first one is, what advice do you have to stop your survey email looking like junk? Is there a particular subject line or intro you would recommend using? Who'd like to take that one?
Shall I kick us off?
Thanks, Lizzie.
Cool, and morning, everyone. Just to introduce myself briefly, I work very closely with Kyra on travel surveys and all things social research to do with transport. So yes, how do we stop the invites looking like junk? I think that's where logos can be helpful, because just from a very quick glance, you can tell whether that's something that looks official or not. But if we are talking about staff surveys that are being emailed out to people, then one of the things that Kyra mentioned was warning people that it's coming and warming people up to it. So you can just tell people it will come from this email address when it hits your inbox, and make sure you check your junk mail as well. And in terms of a particular subject line or intro, have your say is quite short and simple, and we find that's very effective in these types of surveys. Kyra, I don't know if you would add anything to that.
I wouldn't. I was going to say exactly the same. It's kind of like more important, as you said, warning people that it's coming and having a way that they recognize. So tell them what the title is going to be, what the email is going to be. So when it comes through, they just know what it is, so it will not look like junk.
And how important is it, from your experience, that a survey has senior management endorsement? So if you've got a message coming from the CEO, let's say, saying this survey is really, really important, I'd be very grateful if you can complete it, does that make a big difference? Does it make any difference?
I think so. I suppose it might vary from one organisation to the next. Depends how much people like their CEO, I guess. That might be controversial to say. But I think if organisations are doing that, then also using that opportunity from the endorsement or the quote to say what it's going to be used for, why you're being asked to have your say and give your view, what it's going to feed into. That's actually just a good opportunity to do that, so you can kill two birds with one stone.
Okay. Thank you. If there was one thing that everyone should remember when creating a survey, what would that be?
I would say sample. And if I speak more broadly about surveys in general, which I think this question is about, not just limiting this to staff surveys, often we come up with good ideas for what we can do in a survey and how we can ask people for their views, but we have to have a way of reaching people. And if that's not there, sometimes that's quite easy to forget. But if it's a staff survey, it might be straightforward because, of course, you've got everybody's email addresses. But sometimes clients will come to us and sort of say, yeah, can we do an online survey about blah topic? And it's like, great, but how are we going to get hold of them? So in the absence of a bank of a database of email addresses, if you don't have that, then there are panels, for example, and that's where organisations like Ipsos, but also plenty of other survey and polling organisations can find a representative sample for you. But if it's a niche audience, then yeah, you've really got to think about how you're going to get those people, especially if they're low incidence in the population. So people who have used a particular type of app or payment technique to charge their electric vehicle, that would be quite niche. And if that's not coming from the company that handles the payment or the app organization company, then you've got to think, oh, are we really going to be able to get hold of those people? Just to say as well that the question of sampling, and this is so important and why it came first in Kyra's presentation, it is sometimes why we still do things like postal surveys. And that can seem so old school, like, oh my God, this survey's postal, it's not 1963. Why are we sending out letters to people? But I mean, sometimes people just like filling in a paper questionnaire, but sometimes postcode, because that exists in the postal address file, is the only way to get hold of people in a way that's comprehensive and complete and representative, and it can be random probability. So yeah, that would be mine. Kyra and Millie, I don't know if you would have anything different.
I was going to say, just to kind of build on your point, but a bit more kind of in the workplace. It's also to get that sample size of ensuring people have time to fill out the survey. So we all know how kind of hectic your work days can be. But if you have team briefings or team meetings, just setting aside 5 minutes to encourage everyone to fill out the survey in that time, it means they've got that allocated time slot and they're not going to put it to the bottom of their to-do list later in the day.
Yeah, I think it's something you've mentioned before, Millie, about how relentless the communications really need to be over a period of time. You can't just send it out and then think, oh yeah, I'm going to get a really good response rate. You've got to keep different channels open and keep pushing it and create that time for people to complete it.
Yeah. I was going to
Yes.
add a very quick to like actually build on both of Liz's and Millie's points, to say one thing to remember when creating a survey, especially if you design it from scratch, it needs time, and it needs a lot of time, because every single thing from the sample to the questionnaire to the mode to everything, it needs quite a lot of time to be allowed to do that properly. You cannot design a new survey within like, I don't know, a month or two and say that you're going to have reliable data back, because you will have missed stuff.
Okay, all right, I'm going to move on to the next one. What do you think is the perfect number of questions to ask before people get bored?
I reckon the best thing is to think about number of minutes rather than number of questions, actually, because some will be really quick and easy and some might take longer to think about. So 10 to 12 minutes, I think, absolutely fine. Beyond that, not to say at all that it's not going to work and no one will respond. Some of our surveys have been so detailed and they're, 25 minutes long potentially. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, but they can be long if they need to be. But I suppose to talk to the point about avoiding people getting bored, shaking up the question format, avoiding, and I think, Kyra, you might have mentioned this, sort of relentless batteries of questions using exactly the same response scale. That's likely to get you sort of speeders and flatliners as well. But there are other things that can be done to make it engaging, as we've talked about as well.
Any other views, Millie, Kyra?
Yeah, I think also one thing to take into account is whether you're incentivizing your survey. So obviously, if you've got a bigger incentive, people are more likely to kind of sit there and take longer to fill out a survey. Whereas if you're just kind of asking people to do it from their own goodwill, they're probably going to get bored a bit quicker. So maybe a shorter survey is a better option there.
Yeah, and have we found any particular, I think you mentioned earlier, Kyra, that cash seems to work best in terms of incentivizing people, and then cash vouchers, is that fair summary?
Exactly. I think in brief, that's this summary. And yeah, there is research as well that suggests that unconditional incentives, if you provide to everyone that you invite, even if they don't take a part, that actually works. But obviously, most of the surveys, we use conditional surveys, so only if you have taken part, you will take an incentive. So yeah, and like the bigger the incentive, the better, but it doesn't make a huge difference either. I think, like as Millie said, like if you do have a longer questionnaire, if you do give a bigger incentive, it's more likely that they will not drop out.
Okay, fantastic. Right, this is a longer question. Thank you, Nick, for this one. In staff travel surveys, my experience is that we get a better response from people who are walking, using public transport, and especially cycling, and a lower response from car users. I assume this is because they may feel some guilt about driving. I find it best to add some controls, e.g. count the number of cycles in the cycle store on the survey day. I try to avoid generating any guilt shame for people's travel choices, but this is tricky. Are there any suggestions to deal with this problem and other control strategies?
Yeah, I suppose it's talking to two things, and one is a question of representativity. You don't want to put the car drivers off and then fail to get their responses. And the other one is how you make people feel when they're filling out a survey. And it's worth remembering that travel behaviour isn't the most sensitive topic to ask people about. It's not in the same realm as asking people about their alcohol consumption behaviours or smoking or drug use, for example, the main thing, and really one of the only things I think you can do, is reassure anonymity and why it's being asked. So that will hopefully help. To the point about representativity, I really like that you try to add some controls, like counting the number of cycles in the cycle store on the survey day, presumably so that you can get an idea of whether the number of people responding was similar to that number of cycles that you saw. You could consider looking up published sources of information on who is travelling to work and how, not strictly to benchmark against, but just to get some idea. If 80% of my staff have said that they commute to work on a bike, how representative or not is that? And if you looked at, published DFT surveys, maybe National Travel Survey, that would give you some idea of how different your results are compared with the general public.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to push on because we've had several more questions suddenly arrive. So we'll see. We've got about 5 or 6 minutes if we can push through these. How can you account for multimodal travel in your survey? That's probably maybe a Millie starter.
Yeah, so obviously multimodal travel is kind of very dependent on the individual. We quite often approach it of, well, ask what people's main mode of travel is, so what's the mode they use for the furthest distance. So for example, if I'm walking to the train station, getting the train for 50 miles and then walking at the other end, that train journey is what's going to have the most effect specifically for your emissions. But it's also kind of, you can ask what their main mode is, but then following up from that, if they do multimodal, just kind of getting that secondary mode captured as well. So using that main mode for kind of maybe your emissions calculations, but actually then just capturing that secondary mode to understand what patterns people are doing for their commuting. But it's also not just multimodal in the sense of if you're walking to a bus stop or getting the bus, it's also understanding what other options people have. So for example, if your car broke down, how are you getting to work? That's also a great kind of question to capture within the survey, so you can understand what alternative options people are aware of as well. I don't know whether anyone's Let's go on, Mark.
Sorry, I was going to say, and link to that, if their mode of travel varies, so maybe they drive 2 days, but they get the train on 3 days, how do you best capture that?
So yes, we'd always encourage kind of the mode you use most frequently. So if you're traveling in 3 days with one mode, that is your kind of primary option. So we'd encourage capturing that initially. And then if you want to kind of delve deeper into further modes, asking those secondary questions to that.
Okay, brilliant. I'm going to jump onto the next one. This is probably more for Lizzie and Kyra. How would you engage different audiences? They put i.e., maybe e.g., football fans.
I think maybe one of the best ways to do that is to include some soft testing, piloting and/or cognitive testing to see how your survey lands with that audience. So test it with people from that particular group. I guess you could look at similar surveys as well. I don't know if Kyra or Millie have anything else to add on that one.
Yeah, no, I would say if it's like about how you engage and how you kind of like gain their interest, is like, I agree with Lizzie. It's about testing that with people from that group so you can see how it lands.
Okay, thank you. Then I've got one from Guy. Thank you, Guy. Has there been any research done on the efficacy of a large value prize draw, a chance to win £200, for example, or a low value voucher for each participant, e.g. a cup of coffee?
I'm actually not sure. There must be something about low value vouchers for its participants. I don't know, like about a cup of coffee. But there is research and experiments have been done on the large prize draws, and they do work well. I think it's still it's still that, like, if you give cash as incentive or cash like vouchers, they work better than having a chance to win something and not being certain.
Often the decision of prize draw versus voucher or cash for everyone, often it ends up being budget driven as well, because of course with a prize draw you know exactly how much you're going to spend because you're going to offer so many vouchers or whatever it is through the prize draw. But with an incentive for everyone, you're beholden to the response rate, which you won't know until it's done. So that's just an element of risk to watch out for in choosing which one to use.
Okay, fantastic. I mean, there's an associated question here about, can we signpost to research that's been done around incentives? Is there anything you guys will be able to share later that we could circulate?
Yeah, we can certainly have a look. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we touched on this one already. Are there any methods to test how good a survey is before it's distributed to an audience? I mean, you talked about a sample audience, Lizzie, but are there other ways you test that first internally?
Yeah, I suppose if it's a staff survey, you want as many people to do the real thing and not get distracted by a pilot, but that depends how big your staff pool size is. But for any other type of survey, a soft launch or a field pilot is good. I suppose that's more about testing the process. Cognitive testing is quite a technical way of making sure that the questions are understandable to everyone, or at least taking your draft questions and finding out how people are interpreting them, and you get people to think out loud as they do it. If you've got the time and the ability to do that, that's a really good thing to do, because you'll just end up with a survey that's better, it's better designed, and then therefore you probably will get a better response rate and everything will follow from that.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to go to the last question because it's bang on 12. What is a good percentage response for a staff travel survey?
So I think I was going to say it depends on the population of your staff. So we always say you want a 5% margin of error, so that will give you a 95% confidence level in the data. But it largely depends on if you've got a smaller sample of staff, that margin of error will require more responses. Whereas when you get into kind of the hundreds of thousands, the level of responses you need isn't necessarily as high, but it's getting that representative sample size as well across, like I said, different roles and different departments. Very much kind of have different commuting habits, particularly if you're looking at travel. So it's making sure that response rate is representative as well. So it's hard to put a number on it without knowing population size.
So should we be less focused on response rates and more on margin of error?
Yeah, we always concentrate on margin of error, just because response rate, depending on how many staff you have. For example, if you've got 10 staff and you get a 10% response rate, that's actually only one survey response. So it really does depend on that sample size.
Brilliant. Population size is 12,500. Well, we'll write back to you, Mike, and we'll do a little bit of work behind the scenes and give you the margin of error. Sorry, the response rate we need to get a good margin of error for 12,500. Right, that's it. We've gone 12. Thank you, Lizzie. Thank you, Kyra. Thanks, Millie. And thank you all for having joined us. Do look out for our next session in a couple of weeks' time. But meanwhile, have a good afternoon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Right.